Hello and welcome to my Baltic pickup tutorial. I'm only going over the weaving technique in this video, and it's already quite long as is, so if you're new to weaving or you need any refreshers on doing any of these, you should look at my frame loom tutorial. I don't recommend this technique for beginners as the setup can be tricky, but I certainly won't stop you from trying it out anyways. My family is Lithuanian, so the Motifs and Supplemental Fringe originate from there, but Baltic pickup was extremely common throughout the Baltic states. I want to emphasize that you do not have to be of Baltic descent to use these techniques. This is an endangered art and I want as many people to learn and appreciate it as possible. If any of these steps are unclear, please comment your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. If you're a beginner weaver, I really recommend you use cotton as it's strong, doesn't pill up a ton, and won't change much when washed. My white threads are 10-2 cotton and my colored threads are 5-2, both from Silk City, which is my favorite place to buy weaving cones. However, traditional weavings were made with linen and wool. If you'd like to try this out, all of the white warp strings will be linen and all of the colored strings will be wool. Linen is not hard to weave with, but the wool can be fragile and it's very obnoxious when pilled up yarn gets stuck in the sheds. I highly recommend you make sure you know how to fix a broken warp thread if you do this. If you have a loom that you know how to thread and you're confident reading a weaving draft, this is what I'm using for this weaving. Your warps per inch will depend on the thread you use, but you want it to be dense enough that you can't see your weft. I will explain why it's written the way it is, but if you don't care about that, you're welcome to skip to the design options once you've got your loom warped. To be clear, you don't need to know how to read a weaving draft. This diagram is mostly so it's easy to see what order your string should be in. The colors are arranged in two sections, the border sections and the pattern section. The borders stay the same for the entire weaving, so they're in groups of 2 strings. The pattern section will change when we're weaving, so these strings are in groups of 3. This arrangement will make a little more sense when I show you how to follow the pattern drafts. The top section shows the color, arrangement, and threading of your warp strings. Each square represents 1 string. The first row is just the color of the warp string. I'm using red, blue, and purple, but you're welcome to use whatever colors you'd like as long as the colored strings have a high contrast against the white strings. This is all you actually need to know for this tutorial. If a box is colored in the second row, it should be threaded in the first heddle. If a box is colored in the third row, it should be threaded in the second heddle. If you're using my frame loom tutorial, the threading heddles are the first and second craft sticks. The right section shows the treadling pattern, which isn't complicated here as we're only doing plain weave. If a box is covered in the left row, it means you lift the first heddle. If it's colored in the right row, you lift the second heddle. I've written drafts for 3 different pattern motifs: horse, star, and crow's eye. I do apologize if I haven't gotten the names of these quite right. For a lot of motifs, it's hard to find a consensus on one name. You can arrange these however you'd like in your weaving. I personally like to use at least 2 different motifs, but you're also welcome to just use the same one for the whole weaving. It's also up to you whether or not you'd like to add supplemental fringe in your header. You don't have to be Lithuanian to use supplemental fringe, but you should be aware that it's one of the defining characteristics of a Lithuanian sash. Open your first shed and insert something stiff that has a straight edge. I'm using a piece of folded cardstock paper. This will make a clean starting edge, but if you're confident in your weaving abilities, you don't have to do this. Start weaving with your weft in the second shed. Continue weaving until you have roughly an inch of plain weave, which I usually measure with the first knuckle on my thumb. An inch is fairly standard, but you can weave more or less depending on your preferred aesthetics. If I'm weaving a very wide sash, I'll usually do 2 inches. If you don't want supplemental fringe in your weaving, you can skip this step and go straight to the lock-in stitch. Measure out the fringe by holding it roughly where you want the rest of your fringe to end, then up and across where you left off your plain weave, and back down to be symmetrical. Double up this length for however thick you want this to be. Mine is 8 strands. Open your next shed and pull your warp through. Hold this shed open and add the supplemental fringe. I pulled both ends down so I can check that it's centered. Continue weaving for 3 more rows and make sure you really beat down all the extra thread. This is not a standard length either. I unintentionally did 4 rows in my example, and you can definitely tell my second fringe is in a different shed. Your second supplemental fringe is not going to be the same length as the first, so you have to measure this one separately. You want all of your fringe to hang down and be even at the bottom, so this one has a little extra distance to travel. Measure this out the same way you did at the first fringe, but go across the top of what you just wove. You can repeat this as many times as you'd like. I only have 2 supplemental fringes on either end of this weaving, but a lot of the time I'll do 3 so I can have 1 for each warp color. Make sure you have another 3 rows after your last fringe before starting the pattern section. You want to do this step after you have at least an inch of weaving, but before you cut your warp off the loom. Remove your straight edge from the warp. Take an extra piece of string that's comfortable for you to work with. I usually use about 1 yard. Grab the first 2 warp strings. Ideally, you want 1 string that went over your first weft and 1 that went under your first weft. Tie 2 half hitch knots around it. I always think of a half hitch as making a 4 shape on top of the warp and then pulling the string up through the whole of the 4. This first one will be the hardest to do, as if you pull too hard it will slip off, so I recommend holding the tail. Push this knot up against the weft. Tie 1 half hitch knot around all of the following pairs of warps. Unfortunately, the footage I recorded for this didn't save. On the last warp pair, tie a second knot. Trim off any excess. Take a tapestry or embroidery needle and weave it into the first shed. I'm using an embroidery needle since my warp is so dense. My tails are usually very short, so I find it easier to weave it with the needle first, and then put the string through the eye and pull it through. You can check that it's woven in properly, as you won't be able to see the needle on either side of the weaving. Do this from both ends and trim the remaining tails. Open your next shed. For this step, we're only looking at the pattern section. The borders will not change. If your borders don't match what's in the pattern, or you find you're raising and lowering most of the warp strings, you have started on the wrong shed. Technically, you can still weave like this, but the design won't be as clear. For the first row, we will be lowering all of the colored strings in the pattern section. I usually work from left to right, and you can just drop these as you go. Pull your warp through and open the next shed. Look at the first row of your pattern. I'm starting with the bottom row and working upwards since that's the direction I'm weaving in. All of these designs are mirrored, so technically you can work from the top down if that makes more sense to you. Check to make sure the strings you are holding upwards in this shed match the pattern. There will always be 1 white string between each colored string in a raised shed. In this first row, there's only 2 blue threads in the pattern section, so I go through and lower the other pattern threads. If there's a space where you need to raise a colored string, open up that gap and reach down to pull that string up without twisting any of the other strings. I find it helpful to cover the row I just wove with a piece of paper. The design appears very quickly, so you'll be able to tell if you've made an error. It is entirely up to you how many errors you're comfortable keeping in your weaving. Most complex weavings have errors because it's time consuming to undo them, and the average person will never notice them. Once you've woven the last row of your first motif, you can either pick the same or a different one to follow it. You do not need to lower all of the colored strings in between motifs. That is only for starting and finishing the pattern section. Repeat this for as many motifs as you'd like to have in your weaving. Because I like my weavings to be symmetrical, I've woven a little extra since I have a section just for going in between the motifs. This is completely optional. Once you've woven your pattern section to your liking, finish it off by weaving a row with all of the colored strings lowered, just like how we started. Step will be different depending on whether or not you chose to add supplemental fringe. If you do not have supplemental fringe, you can simply do plain weave for an inch, or however long your header is at the start. If you do have fringe, you want to essentially weave your header in reverse. If you're following the standard, this means weaving 3 rows of plain weave, adding the longer bundle of fringe, another 3 rows, then the shorter bundle of fringe. Finish off with an inch of plain weave. Tie the lock-in stitch at this end as well. Cut your weaving off the loom and trim your fringe to be even on both sides and line up with the supplemental fringe if you added any into the weaving. This will be much easier if your scissors are sharper than mine. I cut down the footage a lot so you don't have to watch me struggle to make it even. Since scissors will push the thread away while you're cutting, trim a little at a time and check often how even your line is. If you have a rotary blade and mat, you can also cut your fringe that way. In order to get my fringe the same length on both ends, I fold my weaving in half and line them up. Now you can enjoy your weaving! This channel is brand new and I've got a long list of projects and tutorials I'd like to upload, so if you enjoyed this or just learned something, feel free to subscribe. Thank you so much for watching!